Hi folks, this video is part of the tutorial series for Mark Herman's Empire of the Sun, the excellent strategic level simulation of World War II in the Pacific. We'll use the revised rules included in the second edition, as well as the excellent new Vassal module by Francisco Colmenares. Each video focuses on one aspect of the game system, and we look at the rules both for an understanding of the key mechanics as well as how to use them intelligently in the game. There's no set sequence for the videos, although new players may want to start with supply and activation along with running a basic offensive before moving on to anything else. Okay, in this tutorial we look at supply and activation, two really important concepts in Empire of the Sun, because to do anything, or just about anything other than defend their own hex in combat, a unit has to be activated. And in order to be activated, units also have to be in supply. And it's actually headquarters units which provide both supply and activation for all of the units on the map for both sides. So let's start with taking a look at how headquarters are in supply, because supply is really supply trace, and it is a trace. It is really sort of a two-part trace. First of all, headquarters units need to be able to trace from an ultimate supply source, and then if they do, they are in supply, and then they are able to trace supply and activation onward to the units. So we really need to start with ultimate supply sources and what those are, and it's pretty simple. For the Allies, ultimate supply sources are either the map edges, so could be any of these map edges, and then for the Japanese, the ultimate supply sources are cities in the home islands, and so these are the Japanese home islands here, and almost all the hexes, these three, 1, 2, 3, are the only hexes in the home islands that don't have a city in them. So all those other hexes in the home islands are basically ultimate supply sources. So the idea is that, first of all, you've got to be able to trace from an ultimate supply source to a headquarters unit, and it's a hex trace of any length. And so if you look at the map, an awful lot of the map is water, and that means that the vast majority of the supply tracing is going to be done over water. And pretty much the only thing that blocks a supply trace over water is an enemy zone of influence. And you'll probably recall that the ZOIs are basically thrown two hexes by air units and air-capable units, which includes CVs, CVLs, and CVEs. And to give you a sense of where those are, let's just go, and you can see here at the top right of the Vassal module, if I click these two buttons, the red button displays the active Japanese ZOIs, and the blue button displays the active Allied ZOIs. And the ZOIs that you see here are really the only things that are going to block supply trace, and it takes an unneutralized enemy ZOI to block supply trace. So if we take a quick look, and by the way, you'll notice that a few of these blue ZOIs are crosshatched, so those are being thrown by the LRB units. You'll see over at Pearl Harbor here, there's actually an LRB unit as well as a CV, and so you've got a solid ZOI here for the CV, and you've got a crosshatched ZOI for the LRB. And if I move the bomber over here, you can see it'll move. And the only difference you may remember is that the LRB ZOIs don't neutralize Japanese ZOIs. In general, the two side ZOIs always neutralize each other in the same hex, but bombers, long-range bombers for the Allies don't neutralize the normal Japanese ZOIs. So let's take a look at some of the HQs on the map and understand how they are tracing supply from their ultimate supply sources. In the case of CPAC here at Pearl Harbor, they're tracing from the west coast, no problem. Obviously, they've got coverage with their own ZOI, but they don't need it because there are no Japanese ZOIs anywhere nearby. If we go to Combined Fleet here, that actually is not a sea trace because it's basically sitting in the home islands. So sitting in the home islands, they're going to be in good shape. If we also look down here at the Japanese South Seas headquarters in Truk, that unit, there's actually no ZOI of either side there, but he's able to trace just fine from the home island hexes because there are no Allied ZOIs blocking anywhere along the path. And then if you come down here to the Japanese South HQ, he can also trace just fine from the home islands because he's got ZOI coverage of his own almost the entire way, and there's nothing at all of the allies that's blocking. So those are all sea traces that are working just fine for those folks. By the way, one of the things you may be noticing here is that all of these HQs are in ports, and that is in fact the case. HQs will always be in port hexes, which is another thing that makes water trace quite important. If we look at the other allied HQs on the map, it starts to get a little more interesting. Up here, Siak in Calcutta, he can trace just fine from the western map edge by sea into the port. If there were an unneutralized ZOI over Calcutta for some reason, he would also be able to trace from the western map edge here into Madras, where there's a port, and then overland as well. So that might potentially be a mixed trace at some point. But right now he's got a perfectly good sea trace all the way. If we look down here at Singapore, we are okay for the moment. It's going to start to get a little bit hairy for the guys in Singapore very quickly, because you may be able to tell from looking at this, this is actually turn 2. It's the start of the normal campaign scenario. So Operation IAI is over, and the Japanese have done some of their expansion into the Philippines and Malaya, but the big fun is just about to start. This is where the campaign scenario normally starts if you're not playing turn 1. But so far at the moment, the Malaya HQ is still in supply. He's actually got his own ZOI right here with this air unit, and he's able to trace basically by sea through here, or he could also trace by sea through here at this point because he's got ZOI coverage on both, and there actually is no Japanese ZOI that's blocking at the moment. That will change, and it will change pretty quickly, but for now he's okay. And then if we go to the other Allied HQ on the map, we've got MacArthur here, Southwest Pacific. It's the 22 that's sitting in Manila. Right now, this is a case where, and I'm going to move the air unit out of the way. This is the Far East air unit. You can tell by looking at this. By the way, the second edition of the game and the new Vassal module reflects this. Has a cool feature where when you flip the units to the back side, this is the front side of the unit, and this is the reduced strength side. And the reduced strength side of a two-step unit has a light bar across the middle of it to make it easy to tell that it's a reduced strength unit. So if I move him out of the way over here for a second, you can see that at this point, MacArthur has got ZOIs from these Japanese air units right here that are sitting right on top of him. So General MacArthur and his Southwest Pacific HQ are not able to trace supply in that particular situation. However, he actually does have the Far East Air Force with him at the moment. And so he can trace a supply line basically from any map edge, but the western map edge is the good one. He can trace a supply line from the western map edge, and then this is the first hex that's under a Japanese ZOI, but it's also under an Allied ZOI. And so because there's joint ZOIs there, that's basically neutralized, and we're able to trace okay through any of these hexes. So we actually have to trace by water here, but we trace around here. And you'll notice when you're tracing by water, other units in the hex don't block it. So like this 912, for example, does not block a water trace through the hex that he's sitting in. So MacArthur is in good shape for the moment, but again, that's going to change fairly quickly. There is one more thing that blocks a water trace, and to show it a little better, let's turn these off. So you'll notice, and let me blow up the map a little bit to make it easier to see. You're going to see that on the western edge of this Davao hex right here, the ocean looks a little bit lighter in color than the normal. And you see the same thing over here. You'll see the same thing over here. You'll see it in a number of places. Those are all places where naval movement is prohibited into the hex from that direction. So what that means is you can't move, a naval unit cannot move from this hex directly into this hex, or from this hex directly into this hex. You would have to go, for example, from here to here and then into this hex. Same thing here. You can't get into Davao by going directly like this. You've got to come down and around and into the hex as a naval unit. And so those are basically prohibited movements. and that blocks supply. So in the same way that a naval unit cannot move directly from this hex to Davao, you also cannot trace sea supply directly from that hex. You have to trace it around. So occasionally that comes into play, but in general the big blockage for sea trace is going to be ZOIs. While we're on HQ units, let's just spend a second talking about HQ withdrawal and return. In a voluntary withdrawal, you basically spend a card as a card play and just announce that you're going to withdraw that headquarters unit. And what happens is it then goes onto the map the next game turn where it will return as a reinforcement. So, for example, on turn 2 in the campaign, the allied player might choose to play one card, and as that card play, remove the Southwest Pacific HQ and simply put it on the turn track for the next turn where it would come back as a reinforcement. That's a voluntary withdrawal. Involuntary withdrawal occurs when the hex is basically taken by the enemy. HQs have no combat value and as such can't fight a battle on their own or defend a hex on their own. So at some point, if MacArthur sticks around long enough to see the fight, when his Philippine Corps is destroyed, he will be involuntarily removed from the map, and the same thing happens. He just goes over here to return next turn as a reinforcement. The only difference is it doesn't cost the Allies anything in terms of the card play to do that. Then there is return, and as I mentioned, the normal process is that when you remove an HQ from the map, either voluntarily or involuntarily, it goes to the next turn where it returns as a reinforcement. That just automatically happens if you don't do anything. The option is if you want to accelerate it and actually return the HQ in the current turn, you can do that, but it costs another card play to bring the HQ back, and there are some limitations. For example, for the Allies, you basically have to bring the HQ back in Oahu or Australia or India, and for the Japanese, you have to bring the HQ back in the home islands. So it's generally better. You have more options in redeploying the HQ if you simply let it come back in the following turn. Now let's talk about unit supply. And actually, when talking about supply for units, we should also talk about activation, because the supply rules for supply rules and the activation rules are similar, or the trace rules, I should say, are similar. The supply trace rules are slightly more constraining, and I'm not going to get into all the details. You can actually look at the specifics in the rules yourself. But in general, for example, zones of influence block sea trace of both supply lines and for activation purposes. So as we look at what happens with units, let's talk about the fact that when you're going to activate a unit, you have to have an appropriate HQ to be able to do that. So an appropriate HQ, and again, I won't go through all the details, but U.S. HQs pretty much activate U.S. units. Commonwealth HQs pretty much activate Commonwealth units. They can also activate U.S. air units only. And then you've got the Dutch down here who actually can't be activated by anybody. So this is an interesting, because there's at this point no HQ on the map that can activate them. Now I lie, because actually a joint HQ, if ABDA comes in, ABDA would be able to activate the Dutch, but right now there's nobody on the map that can activate the Dutch at the beginning of the 1942 scenario or campaign. So what that really means is that, and you'll see actually here, oops, wrong one. The Dutch air unit is showing a ZOI here because the module does not know that, in fact, there's no appropriate HQ in range. The module's not actually testing to see if there's an appropriate HQ in range. And you'll recall probably that one of the requirements for an air unit to have an active ZOI is that it needs to be in supply. and because the Dutch here do not have an appropriate HQ on the map, they are out of supply and cannot activate, and so these guys will not only not be able to react, but that Dutch air unit also does not have a ZOI. So to talk a little bit more about units, both for supply and activation purposes, you'll see I've changed the map slightly here. What we have at the moment set up is the 1943 scenario start, and let me turn on the ZOIs, and it makes things easy to see what's going on here. So one of the things you'll notice is that the Japanese have the South Seas Brigade here at New Georgia. And he is tracing, and you'll see that to be in range, a unit, in other words, to be able to actually trace supply or trace activation, a unit actually does have to be within range of its tracing HQ. The HQs, you'll remember, can trace an unlimited supply line from their ultimate supply source, but going from the HQ to the unit, it's limited by the range of the HQ. Another nice feature of the module is you can show the range of any particular HQ. You can see here South Seas has got quite a large range. We'll turn that off, but you can see that the South Seas Brigade is easily within that range. It's only 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 hexes away. And it is under the ZOI of this Marine Air Wing here at Guadalcanal, but it's also under a friendly ZOI, actually not from Rabaul. Rabaul is 1 hex too far away. It's under a friendly ZOI from this reduced naval air flotilla here. So just by way of making the key point, right now the South Seas Brigade, because this whole section of ZOI where there's sort of, you can think of it as ZOI negation, mutual negation, everybody can trace through there just fine. But if this unit, for example, were over there, now you'll notice that the South Seas Brigade is under the U.S. Marine Air Wing ZOI. It doesn't have a friendly ZOI negating, and it can't trace across a hex side that's associated with a hex that has a ZOI. So right now, the South Seas Brigade is actually out of supply and out of activation trace. I'll put that guy back there now, and now miraculously he's okay again. This is probably a good time to talk a little bit about how C-trace and ZOIs play into strategy. And to do that, let's show the range of Nimitz's HQ here. So you can see that he actually has a theoretical reach that includes Gili Gili and Port Moresby, and actually reaches all the way out to Biak over here at the western end of New Guinea. But that's only theoretical because it can be blocked by Japanese ZOIs. And so you remember that we actually do count hexes for the supply trace. And what that means is that if we count the hexes from Oahu to one of these locations at the extreme end, it's possible that they could be blocked by Japanese ZOIs. So if you look at what the trace would be coming from Oahu, clearly we're okay down here. We can trace around. There's no ZOIs in this area. We can even trace all the way down anywhere in here because this Japanese ZOI is negated by the Marine Air Wing at Guadalcanal. But the problem is we would actually have to trace all the way down here and then back up on the back end. And if you count that, you'll find that it actually exceeds to any of the hexes along here. It exceeds the 25 hex range of this HQ. So the challenge is that we've got this bit of Japanese ZOI that's not neutralized right now. And you can start to see the impact for the Japanese of being able to take the mandates. If the Japanese take control of the mandates, which they do by controlling both Rabaul and Guadalcanal, and at the end of the turn during the national status segment, the mandates will switch over and all those bases become Japanese controlled. And then if the Japanese can get air into the mandates and there's no allied air there, then that will block any supply or activation being thrown from Nimitz down here to New Guinea. Now, in a lot of cases, that may not matter because you probably have MacArthur down here in Townsville or someplace close by, and he can supply and activate all those folks. But one of the things that you notice is that the cards some of the cards favor one HQ over another. Some of the cards will have a slightly higher activation value or logistics value if they're used by activating a particular HQ versus any other HQ. And so for the Allies, it's common that either the Central Pacific or the Southwest Pacific HQ would have a slight advantage. And so there might be times when you want to use that card with Central Pacific because you're going to get a couple of extra activations. But you'll find that all these units down here can't be activated by Central Pacific because earlier on in the game, there are Japanese ZOIs here blocking. So from a strategic perspective, that's a good reason for the Japanese to want to take the Mandates and the Solomons and get air in there as quickly as possible. You'll notice that it's also another hex over here is a potential. The Japanese have to take that to be able to use it because it's Allied controlled at start. But air there also has the ability to block ZOI. Or what it really does is it doesn't completely block it. It just forces you to trace the long way around. And if you do that, you're outside the 25 hex range. So let's now look at overland supply trace. And after that, we'll look at a mixed supply trace. But in overland supply, an easy way to think of it is it's sort of the opposite of sea supply. In sea supply, air ZOIs block trace, and units in the hex don't block trace. With land supply, it's exactly the opposite. For land, ZOIs have no effect at all on the ability to trace supply through land hexes, but enemy units do block supply trace through land hexes if there are only enemy units in the hex. And that actually excludes naval. So basically, ground units or air units or HQ units all block supply if there are no friendly units in the hex. And that has some interesting implications that we'll look at in terms of once there's a battle going on in the hex and you now have both sides in the hex, you are suddenly able to trace supply through the hex, which can have repercussions for reaction, but we'll look at that in a couple minutes. Now there's one other really critical piece of land supply, and it's actually new in the second edition, and it's probably the big change in the second edition and makes a difference in the CBI in particular and also to some extent in New Guinea. And that is that if the last hex side crossed in a supply trace is a land hex side, then the hex to be supplied also has to be within 4 movement points of either an HQ or a supply eligible port or Kunming, which is over here in China, if Kunming happens to be a supply source. So that is a mouthful, and it's not obviously apparent exactly what that means unless we look at it. So let's come and take a look at an example of that. So in terms of an initial supply trace, what you'd have is any of the Japanese units in the CBI are going to be tracing from South HQ here. And under the standard rule, a basic supply trace has to be within 12 hexes of South HQ because that's its range. And so you'd go and look and say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. These guys are all obviously within easy range of South. But when you add in the overland logistical range, which is that requirement that since the last hex side crossed here is a land hex side, these hexes also have to be within 4 movement points of either the HQ or a supply eligible port or Kunming, and Kunming won't work for the Japanese because it's not a Japanese supply source. So in this case, let's look first at Saigon. And this situation right here is the start of the 1943 scenario. At that point, bridge over the River Kwai, the card has been played. So these 2 hexes, the transport route is active. So for the Japanese to trace supply to the front, it goes like this: 1/2, 1, 1.5, 2, 2.5, 3, 3.5, 4. So this unit is actually within 4 movement points of the HQ. So this unit's fine, and obviously these units in Rangoon are fine. But this army up here is actually 4.5 movement points from Saigon, or 2, 4, 6, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 if you go this way. So even the fast way, it's too far. So that's where the second possible source of trace comes in, and that is if it can't trace 4 movement points from the HQ, it could trace 4 movement points from a supply eligible port. And that's Rangoon, which is supply eligible because, the definition of a supply eligible port is a port that can trace a legal supply line from any of its HQs up to any range. So it's an unlimited trace from the HQ to the supply eligible port, and the HQ itself actually doesn't even have to be in supply, although usually it will be, but it doesn't have to be. And so clearly it's no problem tracing a supply line from south to Rangoon here. So Rangoon is a supply eligible port. That means the overland logistical range can be traced 4 movement points from Rangoon. So since we have these are all strategic routes here, it's a simple half, 1, 1.5, and these guys here are in legal supply. Now, if this were a situation before the Kwai Bridge were built, it would get tougher. Because it would basically, you wouldn't be able to trace from Saigon at all. You'd be a half, 1, 1.5, and then you'd be 2.5, 3.5, and anything beyond this would be out of range. And this new rule in the second edition makes both Rangoon and Mandalay quite important. Rangoon is actually critically important because if the Japanese don't take it, they don't have a supply eligible port up here, and so they definitely have supply problems pushing any kind of offensive into North India because it's all more than 4 movement points. And Mandalay is important because in order to be able to use the strategic transport network even from Rangoon, you really need Mandalay because that's the center of the network. Let me also point out one other change in the second edition, and that is that there are 3 hexes here that have strategic transport routes that are not built at the beginning of the game. So you can see, for example, in the Impal Kohima hex, this red dot line here signifies that that hasn't been built yet, and there are rules for building that you can check out. Same over here, the Lido hex, that hasn't been built yet at the beginning of the game or at the beginning of the 43 scenario. You'll notice actually this here has been built at the beginning of the 43 scenario. It has not at the beginning of the game. So basically at the beginning of the game, these 2 hexes are mixed terrain and they cost 2 to enter. You don't get the benefit of the transport route. And this costs 1 for clear terrain. And so again, for the Japanese to sort of, for the Japanese or the Allies to conduct operations through here, that becomes a significant logistical factor. So those are all changes in the ground supply situation that become fairly important with the new rules in the second. Let's look now at a mixed trace and some examples that wrap in ground and mixed trace. And we'll stick with the CBI because this is a typical area for sort of confusion in supply. And let's look at SEAC supplying other allied units here. So if you look at this situation, using SEAC for supply, you might think, well, we can trace out to sea here, and when you're using a mixed supply trace, you can only trace out to sea through a port hex. So SEAC could trace out to sea here from its current hex, or it could trace down to Madras and out to sea from Madras, but it couldn't trace here and out to sea from here, for example. And that, in this particular situation, this is not going to really come up very often, but that's the rule. The other side of the rule is you can't, so we're tracing out here, so let's say we want to try and supply these units back here. We've already said you can't trace by land through a hex that has only enemy ground units in it, or air or HQs. So our supply is blocked here. We could trace out to sea here. Unfortunately, we can't trace in here because to trace in land, you need a port. Now, the Allies could supply via SEAC a unit right on the coast here. That's a sea trace, but the trace ends there. You can't continue going inland without a port. So clearly, SEAC is not going to get any supply to these units over here because there are no friendly ports. And by the way, an empty enemy port is no good either. It has to be a friendly port to trace in or out from. So SEAC can't supply these guys back here. So is there another option? In this case, there is. Kunming is a possible supply source. Kunming acts as a supply source. Basically, if the Burma Road is open, so in other words, if Kunming can either trace down to a friendly Rangoon and out from there, or if this logistical route has been built here, it could trace this way over to India if that's not blocked. But neither of those works. So the other option is if the Burma Road is out but the hump is active, then Kunming can be a supply source. And in this case, the hump is active because basically the hump is active. Number one, the card has to have been played, and it has been in this particular case. And number two, there has to be at least one supply-eligible airfield available in North India. That basically means, in this case, it's going to be Dhaka because Dhaka is an airfield. It's friendly. It's in supply because it's right adjacent to the HQ here. So supply-eligible airfields work similarly to supply-eligible ports. And so Kunming is going to be a supply source over here. So these allied units might or might not be in supply. Let's do a quick trace. This is a half a movement point here. This is 1, 1.5. This is 2 if the strategic route in this hex has been built. At this point it hasn't, so it's actually a half, 1, 1.5 plus 2 is 3.5. So this Chinese army here is in supply and okay. And then from here to here, it's actually, this route's been built, but because this route hasn't been built, you can't use the route to benefit going between these two hexes. So it's, remember it was 3.5 to get to here, it's going to be 4.5 over to here. So basically using Kunming as supply with this route not built, even though this one is, these two are, Chinese units are in supply, okay, but the 14th Air Force is not in supply up here right now. Now, let's look at the situation should the Japanese decide to attack Dhaka. Remember, we said that supply trace is blocked here by these units. If, however, this unit, and let's say they're going all out, so they've got 2 armies there because at least 2 to 1 is always great if you can get it. So we're going for a big land battle at Dhaka here. But what that now means is this hex is not blocking supply because a hex with units of both sides in it does not block ground supply. And there's nobody blocking here or here. So once the Japanese do this, and this is where the idea that you trace supply at the moment you're looking, and we'll talk about that more in a second, but the basic idea is that once the Japanese do this in their offensive, when the Allies go to try and react, they test supply at the moment that they're trying to react, and they say, we can trace through this hex because there's units of both sides here. So now there's a good supply line from SEAC to the 14th Air Force. The 14th Air Force is in supply, which means it can then also react, assuming that an HQ trace is possible. And so that's the other important thing to note is one of the differences between an activation trace from the HQ versus a supply trace is an activation trace does not have to go out to sea or back in from sea at ports. So SEAC can trace an activation trace 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, just like that, no problem. It couldn't trace supply that way, but it can trace activation that way. So that's a quick look at some of the complexities of doing land and mixed traces in the area where it tends to be the biggest challenge. Let's look at one more mixed trace in the other area where it tends to be a potential area of concern, and that is New Guinea. And this is a situation that the Allies have gotten themselves into, which might have been more typical in first edition play of the game where there was no overland logistical range. So if you look at this right now, the HQ on the scene is Southwest Pacific. He's got a long throw range of 20 hexes. You look at these Marines up here, and in the original supply rules, it would have been no problem. You just go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You got to go inland to the port. 6, 7, 8. It's only 8 hexes out of a 20 hex range. No problem. This guy's in supply up here. Because if you'll recall, well, basically, if we look at ZOIs, there's so this guy's got an unneutralized ZOI over the hex, but ZOIs don't affect land trace, so he can trace this way just fine. But with the second edition changes to the rules and the new requirement for the overland logistical range, because this is a land trace here, this guy's got to be able to not only be in 20 hex range of Southwest Pacific, but he also has to be within 4 movement points of either the HQ or a supply eligible port. And if you look here, it's 3 for the mountains plus 2 plus 2. That's clearly way more than 4. So with the new overland logistical range, this 1st Marine Division is not in supply via land over here. And if we go back and look at this point, the Allies have neutralized the Japanese ZOIs here, but there's an unneutralized ZOI over this hex, which means that he can't trace C supply out through any of these hex sites here. So in the new 2nd edition rules, this 1st Marine Division over here is actually out of supply. And so one of the things that does is it tends to prevent unrealistic flanking attacks with the Allies throwing troops way up the coast of New Guinea in a situation where they can't realistically get supply. Anyway, so if you're a new player, there's nothing to unlearn. If you're an old player getting back into the game, that's one of the differences in supply with the new supply rules. Last important question is, when do you check supply? And there are several times. Basically, you need to check supply at the moment you want to activate a unit for an operation, or at the moment you want to activate the unit for reaction. But basically, whenever you're going to activate a unit, you've got to check and make sure that that unit is in supply at the moment it wants to activate. And then you also need to check supply if you want to use the ZOI of a unit. And the example we showed in the previous map at the start of the game was when we had the Dutch units down here, and although there's a Dutch air unit, it has no supply, and therefore it doesn't have a ZOI. And so essentially the Japanese can completely ignore its normal ZOI when moving at that point in time. And then the last main time that you'll check supply is at the end of the game turn when checking for attrition. And any air or ground units that are not in supply during the attrition phase can be reduced or even eliminated in some circumstances. So that's the basics of supply and activation in Empire of the Sun. And if you are a new player and haven't yet taken a look at the video on running a basic operation, that would be a good place to go next.